I think my favourite cultural moment from the Labour Party conference this week was Anna Sarwar, Scottish Labour leader, doing a DJ set and doing some dancing, which has been leaked to the world by his many fans.
Anna Sarwar has danced on the campaign trail.
I know, but you know where else he danced? When Newscast did a live show at the Edinburgh
I
Festival in
remember
the
that.
summer.
Really?
Where he did precisely the same moves in precisely the same order
Didn't he
to
try-
precisely the same song.
He tried to teach you them, didn't
Yeah.
he?
Yeah.
How
Can
did
you
that
remember
go?
them?
It went not well.
One is as if you're cleaning your collars, so cleaning your shoulders, so it's
Yeah, removing the lint from your
Yes.
from your shoulders.
That's
Yes,
one.
Yeah.
the other move is dry ray on the side. Do the shoulder, that's it, other side. And then the no, what was that?
I was actually not that bad a dancer, but then when the social media footage of me dancing was leaked, I was like, oh right, no.
I mean,
No.
for a politician, it's always a brave thing to dance.
It
I'm
is.
just going to say 2 words, Theresa May.
Yeah, but Anna Sarwar has managed to reduce the risk by having a highly choreographed set of
Exactly.
moves
He's just doing the same one each time.
Exactly, look very spontaneous. But as our video evidence tonight has shown,
Planned, practice, rehearsed,
Exactly.
spontaneity.
But, he's pretty cool.
Good
I mean, let's
politician.
admit
Good
it.
politician.
He's pretty cool. When he
now for the completely unrehearsed, as you will be able to tell, episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex, also in the Newscast studio.
And it's Vicky sitting next to Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Nick sitting next to Alex in the Newscast studio.
I think so. This is a mashup of the news, Any Questions, and Newsnight.
What
And
a
just my living room.
That
I'll provide the
multi-platform.
venue. You guys provide the intellectual content.
living room with
Right.
should we just point out quite a few pictures of Adam Fleming? I count
And Chris
2
Mason.
pictures.
Is that what
No,
your
there's
actual
only
living
one
room's
of
like?
Chris. There's only one of Chris, but there's 2 of Adam. I think we should point that out.
Anyway, lovely to have you. Well, until that point, it was lovely to have you. Let's listen to a bit of Keir Starmer doing his big speech, his first to Labour Party conference as Prime Minister.
This is a long-term project. I've never pretended otherwise. But conference, make no mistake. The work of change has begun. The patient, calm, determined era of politics as service has begun. Planning reformed, doctors back in theatre, new solar projects, new offshore wind projects, the onshore ban lifted, Great British Energy launched, one-word Ofsted judgments ended, a border security command, a national wealth fund, getting Britain building again, the renters reform bill, stopping no-fault evictions, and the railway services bill, bringing railways back into public ownership.
And that reminded everyone of Gordon Brown's final party conference speech as Prime Minister, where he listed off the more than a decade's worth of achievements for New Labour, and that's Starmer trying to do the same after, 12 weeks rather than 13 years. Vicky, we've had a few nights to sleep on that speech now. What do you remember of it? What do you think of it?
I think he was, and as you can see there, trying to say, look, we are getting things done. To have something else to say other than, I'm going to do some really difficult things and be really unpopular. It's interesting, isn't it, how he's like embracing this idea of being unpopular. It's almost like the Tony Blair masochism strategy during tuition fees, where he just went out and went around the country over and over again, taking questions, taking people's anger. It's almost like Keir Starmer's trying to do that ahead of the budget. But I think, there was definitely a sense that he had to be a little less gloomy. Which I think he was. And I think the most interesting thing he did was when he talked about the trade-offs, about being honest with people, about, look, if we're going to say we want to lock up more criminals, you might have a prison being built in your area and you're going to have to live near it. If you want more houses built for your grandchildren, again, that might be in your area. You're going to have to put up with it. The pylons, if you're going to want green energy. So I think that was interesting. He was quite specific about things that he says he's going to do. I just think conference speeches are a bit too long. I mean, when do you sit there and...
Well, also, we have to stand as
We do have to
journalists.
stand.
We stand at the side.
Yeah.
Definitely not clapping at any of it.
And it's just quite old-fashioned. I mean, this was going... Didn't they do it like this in the 1950s and 60s? It hasn't really evolved.
I once broke that cardinal rule at a party conference. I won't
Well,
say
you took
which
a
party
seat?
it was. No, I found myself clapping during a leader
Blimey.
speech, and the reason why was that I'd fallen asleep, and
often clap in your sleep?
and then everyone, there was this clapping. Oh, I'm not meant to do that. No, I'm not meant to do that.
Rouse-
Oh dear, that's a terrible mistake.
Hopefully it wasn't the days of social social media.
Yeah. So I'm
Video
now
feed.
really careful.
Go on, was it Ian Duncan Smith?
about-
Was it Ian Duncan Smith?
It was actually the Ulster Unionist conference when Jim Molyneux was leader of the party. So that's quite a long time ago. It was on a Saturday. The leader's speech used to be on a Saturday. There we are. That's my
Taking
excuse.
a day off.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to the substance. Alex, I mean, we're talking about traditions and old-fashioned things. Like the tradition at party conferences is that every time a cabinet minister stands up, they have a couple of things to announce that we then all report, and then we talk about the pros and cons of introducing a new policy on whatever. And that didn't happen this time.
No, there wasn't a lot of policy at all. And I guess you could argue that this is a government that's only been in power for a couple of months. And you did hear a lot of them reel out what they see as their list of achievements so far, like we heard Keir Starmer do in his conference speech. But it wasn't packed full of loads of new policy. I mean, they aren't always, but they tend to have something, which is like a centrepiece that they can hang everything else on. And what kind of struck me was that even in Keir Starmer's speech, when he was talking about the trade-offs and the pylons and everything else, which some people have said, well, that's like, blimey, that actually is quite a lot of new policy. I mean, my take on that is if you remember them as they were going through the election campaign, they kept talking about being the builders, not the blockers. They were going to get stuff done. They were not going to be hampered by obstructions and lots of opposition and long kind of processes. I'm still not entirely clear on the how for a lot of this stuff, you know, particularly with things like pylons and planning and house building and even new prisons, as he referred to it. I still am not clear what the mechanism is by which they are going to make that happen. When they talk about planning reform, they are consulting on changes to the planning rules. But again, I'm not entirely clear. And it might sound horribly processy and detailed, but when they run into a lot of opposition from local communities and they're saying they want to listen to people, and this is now beyond house building to all those other infrastructure things that they say so important to their growth mission, I'm still not entirely clear how that's going to happen. Like if a community stood up and said, no, we don't want a pylon or a prison or new housing or whatever it is, what do they do? Do they just build it anyway? I mean, I'm really not clear. So I think we got a lot of clarity about the sentiment, the vision, the direction, what he wants to do, and him trying to explain why he thinks it's all really important. But I'm still not entirely clear on the how. I mean, like I say, they are a couple of months in. It may come, but that's the bit for me that is the next
on
step.
the how over that, what is interesting is you hear Keir Starmer saying Westminster is failing, we need to devolve power. And essentially what they're talking about is devolving power down from Westminster, but up from current local authorities to have much more regionally based local authorities. And they will take the decisions, and therefore there will be sort of less power for local communities because it's going up a few notches.
Of course, the thing is, even if it's mayors, and it's not necessarily mayors in all areas, though that is the favoured model, and more mayors like the Andy Burnhams, or used to be Andy Street, and now, of course, you've got Ben Houchin in the Tees Valley. You know, if it's mayors, they still have to be elected, right? So they've still got to be popular. So I think there's always just going to be a bit of a tension between what they're trying to achieve here. And I think that's the big picture behind a lot of where we're at with the government, in terms of they have banked a lot on getting things moving, growing, going. And, you know, the whole kind of tone of his speech was, it's going to be tough. We'll make the decisions. We'll make the trade-offs. But if we get the economic growth, the country feels better off and you'll all feel better off as a consequence.
Well,
but they've got to get there. That's hanging a lot on that.
But weirdly, the first thing they've done is effectively can some projects. I mean, like the road building. And so there seems to be this, you know, to me, it's really contradictory, isn't it? You know, for reasons that they've explained is that there's a black hole and they can't afford it anymore. And these were unfunded. But, you know, one of the first things they did when they came in is to say, well, we're not going to build that road. The hospitals and your hospitals are going to be built. That's not going to happen. It seems to be going against this whole talking about growth all the time.
Well, and there's a big decision coming up about whether you build the bit of HS2, the new high-speed railway line, from the station in West London that is being built, so that it goes all the way from there to Euston Station in central London. And I remember me and Chris doing an episode of Newscast a few months ago where the National Audit Office had done a report, and I'd had a quiet afternoon, so I'd actually read it. And it said, oh, whoever is Chancellor will have to decide in the summer whether that last bit goes ahead or not, because that's the decision point. And we're now told that actually Rachel Reeves probably won't make a decision until the end of the year on that.
But here's the thing where I think all this is interesting, because exactly as Vicky said, they've already taken a decision on some infrastructure projects, which they put down to what they see as the in-year black hole in the public finances, a lot of those. Are we going to see the loosening of the fiscal rules so that they actually end up borrowing to invest to get some of these schemes off the ground? And the other thing that you picked up from conference was a bit of like ankle flashing, flirting with the possibility. So basically to put in English, because
well, do you know what? Actually, we can listen to Rachel Reeves doing
I'm preempting.
I was going to say
Reeves.
doing the flirting, but that suggests it wasn't an interview with me, and I don't think she was flirting with me, but she might have been intellectually flirting with the ideas you were about to talk about. So anyway, listen, judge for yourself.
the previous government always cut capital spending, which meant it was harder then to grow our economy because we weren't investing in the infrastructure, the new technologies, the new investment opportunities. And so the fiscal rules that I have committed us to in our manifesto and we'll set out in the budget does differentiate between the two.
So the fiscal rules, to be clear, at the moment they're self-imposed choice by the Chancellor, and there's two of them, which is that you don't borrow for day-to-day spending, so for what they call revenue spending day-to-day, and also that she wants to get debt falling over a period. So she could loosen the fiscal rules as a share of GDP over a forecast period, which is about 4 or 5 years.
It has to be falling between year 4 and year 5.
Yeah,
falling
conveniently, always
in the future.
Always in the future.
Never next year, yeah.
But so the one that they're, I think, flirting, if I can return to that term, with the idea of loosening, is that they might be able to borrow more to invest. And you wonder then, is that's how they get the money, at least, for some of these big
But then why didn't they do that before they decided and announced they were cancelling all these projects?
And also what I just don't get, and I've been thinking back on that interview with Rachel Reeves all week, because she was obviously dropping a hint that there's going to be some kind of loosening to her fiscal rules. And you can actually hear it there, because she made a distinction between the fiscal rule that she's got now and was in the manifesto and how it will be enumerated and set out in the budget. So she's leaving some room for it to be different from what we're used to hearing. But then she just trying to get her to actually go a bit further was just, and I just do not see how, if you're still going to have the first rule of only borrowing to invest, but you're still going to have the second rule about your total stock of debt falling, how that allows you to borrow more.
But you would have to loosen the 5-year rule. The 5-year debt rule, which it has to be falling as a share of GDP between year 4 and 5. That would have to be loosened, but she's got cover to do this because the OECD put out a report this week, and they were saying that they
think the rich clubs think tanks,
and they were saying the UK economy is doing well, but they're worried that they're a bit short-termist on investment. So cover from the OECD, and the Office for Budget Responsibility at the end of August put out a report talking about the benefits of long-term investment and essentially saying you might want to relax this. Now, to have the cover from the Office of Budget Responsibility is a big deal because Rachel Reeves is increasing their power. She sets an awful lot of store by what they say. And so were she want to do this, she could do it. And it's interesting, when you talk to Treasury sources and say, look, are you going to relax this? They point to what Rachel Reeves said before she became Chancellor, the May's lecture she did earlier this year. It was like this really serious lecture. And she said in there, I believe in borrowing to invest.
And politically, that would give her some cover, if you like, because, of course, she's really prided herself on being seen as the Chancellor who's responsible with the public money, who's not going to play fast and loose with the public finances. Trust us, I'm going to take this seriously. I'm fiscally responsible. But exactly as you say, Nick, if she has got people like the OBR kind of saying it's okay, it might be a sensible thing in the long term, it gives her the political cover that she might need if she chooses to go down that route.
But Vicky, this is like the hokey cokey she's doing here, isn't it, Rachel Reeves? Because do you remember in the old days of, a year ago, there was going to be this 28 billion Green Prosperity Fund to invest in decarbonising the country. Then that got whittled away to hardly anything, and now it's being whittled back up by the sound
That's what it does feel like mixed messages a bit, I think. And I think that's people watching it will be thinking, I'm not sure now what they're aiming for here. Yes, they're aiming for growth, but then she's talked about her rules. Now she might not be sticking to those rules. And the thing is, so much is now people waiting for the budget. And I think that's part of where some of the anxiety that I think we felt at the conference is from, the nervousness, because they've talked a lot about these difficult decisions that are coming. We don't know what they are. Obviously, the one they have done, which is the winter fuel allowance, has caused, such a storm. People are worried about what else there is going to be. And then going back to this whole notion of there being really no announcements. I mean, there was a bit of a sort of eyebrows raised when we found out that one of the announcements was a minister for the HMRC. And we were like, okay, that's the announcement. It's not going to shift the dial at this point, is it? And so I think, they need to come up with some things. It sounds like it's going to be the budget. And there were cabinet ministers saying, well, we knew we didn't have any announcements from our department, but we did assume that someone else was going to have some announcements, and certainly that there were going to be some from Sir Keir Starmer. And by having that void, I think it did leave a bit of a gap for other things to be discussed.
And there was unease about that void because obviously, as we know, we've covered it in great detail. It was not a great run up to the conference for Keir Starmer with all that stuff over donations and clothing and all that sort of stuff. And I was talking to one member of the cabinet who's very close to Keir Starmer, and they thought one of the problems that made that made that worse is Vicky's point, is that there was a void in the run-up to conference. They weren't announcing anything. And the significant thing I thought about Keir Starmer's speech is it did fill the space. It went down very well in the conference hall and in the party, and it sort of filled that political space. And that's what a prime minister needs to do, because if you don't fill the space, then the space is taken up by things like your clothing and your donations and things like that. So from that point of view, the speech did the job.
One of the things that really struck me standing at the side of the hall was there was a whole massive section of the audience that was for Labour MPs. And I actually haven't been in the House of Commons in this Parliament yet. And that was my first time seeing them all sat in one place. And you realise there's a lot of them. It's a lot of people to get to know. And I'm not quite sure where the Venn diagrams are of what the little sort of groupings are going to be. Like who's going to be friends with who, which group of MPs is going to campaign on one thing. Is it going to be like the Conservative Party in the last few parliaments where you had geographical groupings that kind of got together and caused problems?
You want two really good facts about the new Parliamentary Labour Party?
Please.
So the Women's PLP, so that's women Labour MPs, there's more of them than there are Conservative MPs. And the newly elected Labour MPs make up, I think, just over 50% of the Parliamentary Labour Party. So they really matter. And that's one of the reasons why Keir Starmer appointed, I think it's 5 newly elected MPs as ministers, which is like unheard of. And the view is they are such a big cohort, you can't ignore them.
And of course, no block of MPs is a homogenous blob, and this is a particularly big block of MPs. So they're not all going to think in exactly the same way about things. And I suspect over the course of a parliament, you will get groupings form and people of similar mindsets on similar things form. And in the very early weeks, remember, of this government, despite the fact he had a whacking great majority and a resounding victory at the general election, we already saw a little bit of discontent and disquiet over 2 particular issues. One was the 2-child benefit cap, when some MPs, it's probably safe to say some MPs, you might not have been entirely surprised by their names, who chose to rebel against the government's position and then were subsequently suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party for 6 months. And then the second one was, of course, was on the winter fuel payment, where there were a huge number of abstentions, people that chose not to support the government on that vote. And the message from Downing Street was most of them were given permission not to be there. But, you know, you're already starting to see just some of the fact that not everybody is entirely aligned. But having said all of that, you cannot get past the size of Keir Starmer's majority, right? He's got a really significant numerical advantage in the House of Commons right now, and that isn't going anywhere anytime soon. And I would say, for conference overall, I mean, there was a sense of celebration. There was a sense of the significance of the moment, that this was a party,
especially amongst the new MPs. I think that's where I felt that much more, because, you know, we did think, oh, it's a bit flat compared to last year, where there was the sense of anticipation. There seemed to be more joy last year, whereas this time you felt they were a bit nervous, a bit anxious. You know, it is difficult being in government, but I did feel amongst some of those some of them very young MPs, they were pretty excited.
I think that's right. I just think what they are conscious of is what we've heard from people in the party itself, actually, is just how potentially fragile the kind of support for the government might be. They did win a big victory at the election. There's no taking away from that at all. But Labour Together, for example, put out a report saying that actually the voters are quite fragile. You've got to make sure you're delivering for them. And I think there was a real consciousness of that. And I think despite the fact there was definitely celebration and excitement among the new cohort and others, I think there is an awareness they have got to deliver for people quite quickly. And there was also a consciousness that perhaps this first conference was just a bit bumpier than they might have liked.
I mean, it's the winter fuel, means testing the winter fuel, that has really tested the new MPs, because they are generally loyal to Keir Starmer, but they have, as have all MPs, had a huge backlash in their constituencies. And it's not sort of campaign letters, it's individuals writing in with their individual stories. And that, I know, has really alarmed a lot of the newly elected Labour MPs. But my impression is that the leadership has done a pretty good job from its point of view of ensuring that the new cohort are pretty mainstream and are not exactly from the Jeremy Corbyn wing of the party. They are all reasonably mainstream figures.
And I picked up 2 themes, and this happens every new parliament, is them just getting their heads around the logistics of travel and childcare, and that's kind of quite cute hearing that from them, because that's not a side of politics that actually ever gets really reported on. It's never the news unless there's massive donations attached to it. And the other thing is them bending the civil service to their will, because the civil service, even though the civil service is the government. It's not the same as the government.
There's also the element of scrutiny. A party that's been in opposition for so long, you can sit there and you can just lob stuff at the government, and there was a lot to lob, wasn't there, against the Conservatives as they were going through their troubles. And it's just that notion of suddenly you're in power, you're in number 10, you're now the ones who are at the centre of all of this. And I just think they're not used to it. And the last time that Labour were in power, the media landscape's completely changed. And I think it's that, the quick news cycles, the social media, all of that stuff is different. And I think they're getting a bit angry about it.
I just said there was this thing that ran through my head, but it was like, if you think of the last conference, like Christmas Eve, when you're dead excited, something's coming around the corner, but you're careful not to drink too much in case you ruin it all. Then this conference was like Boxing Day, when you've ended up with loads of presents, but now you've got to work out what to do with them all.
I got that same metaphor from someone. Obviously, that was the meme.
I reckon I know who you got the metaphor from, which is who I mentioned it to at a conference, who said, that's quite good, you should use that. So because I made it up in my head, I promise you.
Oh, okay. Right. Now, I talked about travel and logistics. Someone who's been really grappling with that is Keir Starmer, and our own Chris Mason.
Hello newscasters, welcome to New York. You can take the boy out of the Yorkshire Dales, you can't take Yorkshire Dales out of the boy. Whenever I come to New York, I've only been a few times, I just find myself mesmerised staring at the sky the whole time, at all these buildings that just go up and up and up and up. Prime Minister's been here for the last few days at the UN General Assembly. We're at the NASDAQ building here, the money men of New York. So what's going on? Well, the Prime Minister is meeting Donald Trump at Trump Tower. Quite something this, because he's never met the Vice President, Kamala Harris, and it's a bit tricky diplomatically when you meet one side and not the other. Downing Street say they'd like to meet the Vice President if they can. The argument that they're making is it's important to meet people face to face. Big gulf between the Prime Minister and quite a few other Western leaders and the Trump campaign on that key question of Ukraine and support for President Zelensky. Other thing the Prime Minister's doing is his big speech at the UN General Assembly. Real focus there, as you might expect, on Lebanon and indeed on Ukraine, and a sense of his overarching outlook on foreign policy and the massive challenges, whether it be war or climate change and a number of other things that the world confronts. And then the Prime Minister will be back on the plane and zipping back to the UK. Next week, he'll be heading to Brussels for the first time as Prime Minister to meet the European Union. Talk to you soon. Oh, and one more thing. We've just nipped down the lift to street level in Times Square, and look at that. The Prime Minister getting his own welcome on one of those massive New York screens. Even gets his mugshot up there. Turns out, I think it's fairly standard that if you get a visitor, high-profile visitor, and they get a few in there, you get your picture on the wall for a little bit. 20 minutes, I think. Anyway, some of these things that you see in New York that you wouldn't see back home. Talk to you soon.
Nick, do we know if he's got like a big offer to make to the EU? Is this going to be kickstarting what they're not calling the negotiations, but like the actual process of changing the relationship?
Well, the big offer is the reset, that they want to have friendly relations with the European Union and they don't want to feel that it's all tense. And Keir Starmer always does give credit to Rishi Sunak for beginning that process with the Windsor Framework, which sort of renegotiated effectively the arrangements over Northern Ireland with the Brexit deal. So, yeah, he wants to have that reset. There are specific things he's thinking of, and he's been very clear about it. He wants, for example, a veterinary agreement, which would reduce a huge number of the checks between Great Britain and the European Union, and it would have a huge impact on the Great Britain-Northern Ireland checks. So he wants that. The significance of a veterinary agreement is that, yes, it would have a role for the European Court of Justice, but it wouldn't involve free movement. Keir Starmer is relaxed about the European Court of Justice, very unrelaxed about free movement. What the European Union is saying is, if you want to have a closer relationship with us, guess what comes top of our list? It's mobility. And so that's why we're hearing a lot about youth mobility.
People moving.
People movement. But the European Union is being very, very clear and saying, look, we understand your anxiety over this. So it's youth mobility. It's not free movement. It would be under 30 and it would be time limited. But it's just very interesting that if you want something from the EU, a veterinary agreement, you're going to have to have something in return. There's a sort of a totality of the relationship.
I tell you what that sounds like, Nick. A trade-off.
That's what it is. As Vicky said, that was
A
the
massive
big
pylon in
theme.
diplomatic form. I mean, I had such
A pylon or a pylon.
Well, with a Y. I had such like a deja vu moment at the Labour Party conference because I had a meal with a figure from an EU country, and that's what I used to do my old job in Brussels, like every night of the week and lunch and breakfast. That's why I put on a stone and a half when I was there.
They don't call it the Brussels bulge for
Yeah,
nothing.
exactly. Stop talking about my bulge. Anyway, I've lost my train of thought now. But the reason it was so retro was this person was like, oh, the UK has just not been very clear about what it wants. They need to be more specific. Do you remember that tick? The UK's got to remember they're the demander now, that word they always use.
Did they mention cake?
You're the junior. No, they didn't get to that one. Yeah, I was getting, this is too cliched. Stop already. The UK is the junior party here. They don't get to just demand. And then I was just thinking already, it's like, oh yeah, is this going to be a repeat of the UK thinks just because it's managed to agree amongst a certain amount of itself what it wants, that's so different from actually achieving something.
Do you think he might be able to achieve something next week?
But yeah, I think so. I was just picking on what Adam said. I mean, I met some sort of EU figures in the last few weeks, and very
Deja
much
vu too.
Deja vu, and very much hearing, what does the UK want? Well, we sort of know what the UK wants. It wants this veterinary agreement. But I think essentially what they're saying is don't assume that just because you're smiling at us and being nice to us, that the fundamental bargain changes. And the fundamental bargain is if you want a lot of sovereignty, then you don't get much access. If you're not fussed about sovereignty, then you can have lots of access.
There is a big trip coming up that we think he's going to be doing because it's the Commonwealth Heads of Government.
Yeah, I mean,
it's in Samoa, which is a long way away.
Yeah, and it's the sort of days running up to the budget, pretty much. I mean, it would be really unusual for a British Prime Minister not to go to that. So they never confirm travel plans very much in advance, but it would be very unusual. But yes, I mean, to be very blunt about it, it's a very long way away. And I think it's interesting in the run up to the budget. We've known from previous governments, there are negotiations quite often between number 10 and number 11. And there were people, like Treasury people saying those OBR forecasts, all those numbers, they come back, they're regular. It's not just like one time they come back and say these are the figures. It's an ongoing process which runs to the wire. So to be out of the country, potentially, if he does go, in the run up to that.
On CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government, basically Prime Ministers always go, well, it's not really a massive priority. But the reason why they have to go is because the monarch is there, because the monarch is the head of the Commonwealth. And just to give you an example of that, I went to the CHOGM in Perth. I think it was about 2011,
in Australia,
2012. Yeah, Perth in Australia. And David Cameron was meant to go for the week. He was meant to go to New Zealand. He was meant to do the east coast and the west coast of Australia. He ended up going for 36 hours because there were 2 European Union summits that week because of the Euro crisis. And it was absurd to go to Australia for 36 hours. We were on the ground for the same amount of time that we were in the air, but he had to be there because the Queen was there.
Right. Well, thank you three for being here. Thanks to Any Questions Newsnight and the News for lending you to us.
On the theme of the monarch, Adam, can I just say that I think it's really important. I think it's really important to go back to the photographs on the desk because they're like,
doesn't it remind you of the late Queen's old
It reminds me of
table?
those pictures you see of when the monarch is doing their Christmas address.
Christmas.
There are all these pictures on a table, lots of very grand pictures, and I think we should just remind people there are 2 pictures of Adam on the table there. I think,
I can see how much the frame's worth.
There you go. So Nick accuses
No
me of being
expense
too grand.
spared.
You accuse me of being too cheap. You can't win them all. I see these trade-offs that Keir Starmer was talking about. Right. Thanks very much for watching this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.